archaeology at the site tell us about Chinookan communities historically?
Between Cathlapotle and Meier, and I have to include Meier, we're getting a really clear, they lived in these really large, and the focus of the sort of structuring focus of the research has been on how these really large households that characterize the area operated and how they functioned both socially and economically. The area had a really high population density, and how that big household-based economy supported all those people. So we're getting a really interesting idea about how those households worked as economic units. And then the other thing we're gaining is, again, this window into that early fur trade in terms of how these people at these two sites were responding similarly and differently to the arrival of Europeans.
So this is pretty unique to have both the pre-contact and the contact.
Yeah, right. It's very unusual. Usually contact era sites, most contact era sites that have been done in the West are fur trade posts. So you get like Fort Vancouver, where you get a really rich record of that, but an actual native record is real. I'm sure there are other sites, I know there are other sites, but the focus, what happens in archaeology is that there's a funny split. There's what's called, quote, I don't like the term, but there's prehistoric archaeology, which would be the archaeology of native people, and then there's historic archaeology, which is the archaeology of Euro-Americans. And those two groups kind of don't always mesh. And so what happens is that when it gets up into the fur trade, well, that's historic archaeology stuff. And then, but what we have here is a really nice interaction between the two. And we've been able to, anyway, get access to, we have the opportunity to stumble into this extraordinary set of sites that span the period. So it's unusual. They're unusual. There may be others, but they're unusual in the fact that they've actually been excavated.
And you have more than 4 centuries of occupation,
yeah, right.
Which seems pretty extraordinary to successfully exploit this environment over this period of time.
Yeah, that may seem long to you. You're an historian. To me, it's not very long. I think of things in terms of tens of thousands of years. But the record is a 400-year record. There were people here probably well, we know there were people here for 11,000 years. And so there were people on that floodplain for at least that long. The record we have is very short as a consequence of sea level rise, post-glacial sea level rise. So the floodplain that you see that we're sitting next to is only about 3,000 years old. The rest of it's down below. So for example, ash from Mount Mazama, Crater Lake, which is at 7,000 years ago, is between 40 and 60 feet down. So there's a whole lot of stuff down there that we don't have access to. But anyway, yeah, a 400-year record is really long, but I'd rather have a 2,000-year record.
Well, these are pretty complex societies
right.
that were hunting, gathering, foraging.
Yeah, I say that way because one of the things that's happened, you asked me early on about changes, is that the whole notion of hunter and gatherers is being changed. So for example, one of our research topics that we really haven't been able to tackle is the whole question of environmental manipulation. We wanted to get evidence for burning, which we weren't able to get funding to do. But the native people in the area, we think burned a lot, which is a form of environmental manipulation. There's ethnographic evidence and ethnohistoric evidence of significant manipulation of the environment. We have some indicators of that in the material that we've recovered. We have giant acorns, for example, which apparently is a reflection of oaks being regularly fired. So in any case, so they're not farmers, but they're not stereotypic hunters and gatherers because the environment is probably significantly manipulated. It's a real anthropogenic environment, partially intentionally, and then partially as a consequence of there being thousands of people here for several millennia, and the environment becoming modified and affected by that.
What can you tell about the size of the population from
Well, there's a Robert Boyd, who's an ethnohistorian, did a very fine study. It started out as doctoral dissertation in the 80s, and then he published a book, Coming in the Spirit of Pestilence, in the late 90s, which I think updated it. He's done some updating. And so Bob's work gives us sort of a basis. We have estimates, fur trade era estimates, that would suggest that the immediate area around here may have been homes to a minimum of 3,000 people. It would swell perhaps in the spring and summer to as many as 10,000. But there's also the effect of multiple epidemics, particularly smallpox from the mid-1770s on into the 1840s, and then a devastating malaria, a series of malaria outbreaks in the late 1820s into the early 1830s. So in the Soviet Island area, for example, the population of the town of Lewis and Clark was probably around 3,000 to 4,000 after the epidemics. After the malaria epidemic, population was down around 300, 500 people. So that it's hard. You have to go back and calculate backwards estimates of loss. And usually what people use is the notion of about 30%, which may be way too low. There was a whole sideline of North American native anthropology, which has involved fights over how many people there were. They swing back and forth from small estimates to big estimates. So here, I don't want to be, you're going to put this on your website, but probably, I would guess, I would think around 10,000 people permanently in the immediate area is not a bad number. It could have been higher, it could have been lower, but 10,000 to me seems like a good link, seems reasonable in terms of what we know from the ecology and things like that. I had a student do a study on Wapato, and she went through the flood and all the SO just on Soviet Island, and figured that if Wapato constituted 20% of the population, the area would, could support 30,000. Soviet Island could support 30,000 people, and there's nowhere near that many there then. So one question we might then ask is, why not? Anyway, so it's really dense populations as you look at hunter-gatherer populations, if we want to use that term, across the world. This is in the top 20 or 30 areas for lots of people, next to California and a few other places.
Well, the other thing that your archaeological work, of course, has shown is the complexity.
Yes.
That exists despite the fact that there's not agriculture.
Right.
There's intensive management of these systems.
In terms of intensive management of economic management, there are a couple of interesting things. One, there's a site on Soviet Island which has the unfortunate name of Sunken Village, and it's a wet site that contains baskets that were set into the intertidal zone in Multnomah Channel. And a joint project between South Puget Sound Community College outside of Tacoma and the Japanese actually spent, Dale Crows, who's an archaeologist, spent a couple summers doing some work there, trying to ultimately it's a stabilization project. It's one of those cultural resource management projects having to do with stabilizing the levee in the area, the archaeologists there. And they estimate that those baskets, if they were all contemporary, and that's a good question, would hold up to 1 million acorns at a time. That seems like a lot of acorns, but again, it's enough for about 230, 240 people. But that's still pretty intensive because you're going to collect them all and things like that. Another piece of evidence for the intensity of the economy is that the houses had cellars. And I mentioned the Meier house. Its cellar is large enough to hold, this is just a cellar, is large enough to hold 26 tons of Wapato. And if you count the roof, the stuff under the eaves, it's even the storage space is even larger. We went in search of comparators. It's hard to find people's, the storage potential of this is this and this and this. But there was a Greek archaeologist who was doing work on Bronze Age peasants in Crete, and he went through and came up with these wonderful estimates of the storage potential of Cretan peasant houses and small Cretan Bronze Age palaces and really big Cretan Bronze Age palaces. And the Meier house has more storage potential than the Palace of Knossos, which is the big Bronze Age palace in Crete. Those people. So what are they up to? Is this for trade? We estimate the population of the house was about 203 people. So if you're putting up 26 tons of roots, that's not all that's in there, but there's also tons of, is this for trading out processed food? Is this part of their economy? So there's a whole set of questions that comes out of this in terms of what they're doing. But yeah, it's a remarkable economy. It's much more, we didn't expect that. This is one of those things where people would say, well, Ken, what have you found that's exciting? And I said, we found cellars. And I think, oh yeah, and then, oh yeah, so I think I'm moving right along here because they're wanting me to talk about, fancy artifacts and stuff. And I'm talking about holes, really big holes in the ground. But it's quite extraordinary. These are the only cellars that we can document of this scale in native North America, and we've tried to track down other features like them in the world, and they're here and there, but not many. It's until you get farming, and the farmers do this, but these folks don't. In general, people have storage pits. The Japanese, there are some really big storage features in Japan with hunters and gatherers in Japan, but it's not usual.